and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Alberto de la Cruz, who is the managing editor of the Babalu blog. Welcome to our program. We'll be discussing the very curious and mysterious case of a US diplomat who was uncovered to be a spy for Cuba, of all places. All of that is quite significant in light of broader political and intelligence related developments involving Cuba, and we'll be talking about them more a little bit later. But first, by way of introduction, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, about Babalu blog, we'll get started with that.
Sure. How are you, Irina? Thank you so much for having me on and having Babalu on your wonderful show. As you mentioned, I'm Alberto de la Cruz. I'm the managing editor of Babalu blog. It is a English language website that's dedicated to human rights and political and cultural issues dealing with Cuba, being that it's English language and was founded and run by Cuban Americans. It's from a Cuban American angle. The founders were all from South Florida, so as you can imagine, it's the whole Cubans in Florida thing. But Babalu has been around since we celebrated our 20th anniversary in June of 2023. Babalu went live in June of 2003 and has been going strong for 20 years since then. And we have become a source for, as I mentioned, news on Cuba, news on Cuba policy, Cuban Americans, cultural, and sometimes some recipes and fun and food and all those things that are part of our culture. And it's all in English, so it's accessible to everyone in the United States and Canada and anywhere else in the English speaking world. So you can get a good idea of how of our thoughts and how we view things.
What's in a name? What does the Babalu blog refer to?
Well, it refers to Babalu, which is a Cuban Santeria god. But the reason we called it, it was named Babalu, is all of us being Cuban American and being raised here in the United States in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, we all grew up watching I Love Lucy reruns after school. And for us as Cuban Americans who, many of us, like for instance, I was born in Miami. I was born here, but I was raised as a Cuban. I didn't really know I wasn't born in Cuba till I was like 5 or 6 years old. It came as a surprise to me because all of my family had been born in Cuba, my brothers, my sisters, everybody in my family. But I was just as much American as I was Cuban, because inside the house, everything was Cuban culture. Outside the house, it was American culture. And then when all of us were together, it would be that Cuban American culture. But going back to I Love Lucy, that was the only show on TV that we could relate to because it had the Cuban side and the American side married, both literally and figuratively. You had two different cultures that were functioning together and enjoy, and taking advantage of the greatness of each culture. So we would watch that, and it would be perfectly acceptable that Ricky Ricardo would start yelling in Spanish when Lucy would get him upset, because that's how we saw our parents do. And it was perfectly acceptable to us to see Lucy get upset when Ricky would do something Cuban that she wasn't used to, because we were used to it with our American friends that weren't used to seeing us do that stuff. So that was a show that we really related to. And as you know, the famous song from Ricky Ricardo, which was a song made famous by another Cuban singer, but he also played it, was Babalu, as you remember him with the Congo hitting Babalu, and that's how the name came to be, because it was the one show that we could all relate to.
Oh, that's a great story. And today, of course, the Cuban American community is very successful. It's very active in both political and cultural life in the United States. And it has, in fact, been a prime example of a very positive stream of immigration, and very, very positive for us, very negative for Cuba, that lost so many wonderful people who have come here and contributed here. And of course, a lot of it is tied directly to the Cold War, to the fact that Cuba has, throughout the Cold War, had a horribly repressive communist government, which is still the case, unfortunately, today. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union, after the so-called end to the Cold War, a lot of it has faded from view on many levels and has essentially become less politically relevant. Other threats have emerged, and have replaced the Cold War tensions in our realm, in the media, and certainly in the political discourse. That is until fairly recently, when we have started all sorts of issues springing up in that part of the world. Once again, not that they ever fully stopped, but they started coming back to our radar. The most recent of these issues, and I'll go back to the framework for all of this momentarily, is the recent story of an American diplomat, an ambassador by title, who was found, who had a great deal of experience in several countries, including several Latin American countries, and he was found to be spying for Cuba. Now, there is something to be said that this may have been just a hiccup left over from the Cold War. The guy is an old agent. He's been at it for over 40 years. He only just got caught now, and this is probably the end of an old story rather than the beginning of a new one. But I'm not entirely sure, and I find that it's curious that it came up just now, as many other things are unraveling. I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people would like to think it's an old story that just happened to come up, but Cuba's been involved in espionage here in the United States and all over the world for decades. And for all its inefficiencies of the Cuban dictatorship, for its inability to house and maintain housing for people, for its inability to feed them, its crumbling healthcare system that's on the verge of collapse, despite what people like Bernie Sanders will tell you. Besides all of the the inability and inefficiency and corruption of that regime, their intelligence service is one of the top in the world. And we have to keep in mind that one of the reasons for that is that they were trained by the Soviets, not just the Russians, but East Germans and other Soviet states. Perfect example, the Kremlin was very much involved in building out the counter-espionage and counter-surveillance and the espionage program of Cuba. But for instance, Cuba's state security apparatus, which is viciously brutal, and no one, I always joke that, things that happen in Cuba that the Cuban government says they don't, they had no idea that was happening. Going back a few months when they were Cuban mercenaries showed up in Russia fighting against Ukraine, and the Cuban, we had no idea that was going on, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. You cannot pass gas in Cuba without state security knowing about it. They have everything wired, everything tapped, everything under surveillance. And the reason for that is that they were trained by the very best. The East German Stasi is the one who gave them the training on how to surveil your citizens. So people would like to say that, that old Castro regime, that old Castro, that's all gone. None of it is gone. It is in full force. It is there. It operates the same as it does before. The only difference now is that your Raul Castro will show up dressed in a suit instead of dressed in his army uniform to give the impression that, we're regular folks just like you. We're a regular world leader just like you. But it's the exact same thing. So my take is this has nothing to do with this has nothing to do with an old spy that maybe in the 80s or 90s did some stuff during the early 90s before the Cold War. This is another Ana Belén Montes. If you or your listeners are not familiar, Ana Belén Montes was very high-ranking DEI official with the United States Department of Defense, had access to an incredible amount of classified data, and she was feeding it to the Cuban dictatorship for 20 years. And a lot of people didn't hear about it or didn't really get as much splash because she was arrested on September 10th, 2001, I believe, right before 9/11. So that kind of got forgotten because it was right around that time. But there's been books written about her. As a matter of fact, she just got out of prison and she doesn't regret anything she did. She was one of the books written about her was called True Believer, and that's what she was. She never got paid for any, at least that from the investigation found, she never got paid for any of the stuff that she did. And I think this guy, Victor Manuel Rocha, who was a U.S. ambassador in Bolivia and in Argentina, worked at the U.S. interest section in Havana, Cuba, was in the NSA, and provided insight and policy input regarding Cuba and Latin America. He was another official that had access to incredible amounts of information, and by his own admission, was feeding all he could to the regime, to the Cuban regime.
Now, I find a lot of strange flags story is being reported. For instance, our friend Rocha is the way it's covered, he's an unrepentant communist who, in the later years, posed as a MAGA Republican somehow in the contract private circles where he ended up entering after his stints at the State Department and elsewhere. Now, it's curious if this is someone who got recruited in the 80s and 90s. That was in the 80s, at the peak of this espionage standoff between the Soviet Union and the US. How, after all this time, and after all these other guys got caught making mistakes, all these Soviet spies ended up being eventually exposed for what they were. How did this person manage to survive up until today? Managed to outlive them all in terms of his political usefulness to the regime?
I think it has to do. I mean, I don't know. To me, it's astounding that someone like him could have been around in the State Department since 1981, and by his own admission, he was recruited before he went into the State Department. So he started at the when he started at the State Department, he was already a Cuban asset. I don't know how someone like him, someone like Ana Belén Montes, all these people, and I'm afraid that they're not the only ones, and they haven't been the only ones. There's been others. There was Walter Kendall Myers, who worked for the State Department, that was a spy for the Cuban regime. There was another a professor at FIU down here in Miami. Him and his wife were spies for the Cuban regime, gathering information that they found here in Miami in the exile community. Since a lot of politics goes on here and a lot of policy is made here and a lot of or discussed here, So these are not the first ones that they get. There's that they have, and I don't think by any stretch of the imagination are we even seeing the majority of them being caught. I think the majority are still hidden. Will probably most likely remain hidden forever. We may never find out about it, barring a situation in Cuba like happened in the Soviet Union, where the whole regime falls and all the documents are taken out and put up for public review, like happened in the different states of the Soviet Union, where people were able to go see and who was, because if they wasn't for those files, I know I've read articles and about it. If it wasn't for those files, people would have never known that their neighbor had been an informant for state security for 30 years because they kept it so secret. So, but I think the Cuban regime has such a good spy network and training, and they know how to pick the right people. Very similar to how the Soviets did, where they would find people that were sympathetic to them, not people that were looking for money. They didn't want people who were looking for money because they could turn on them. They wanted people who would do it for free. And those are the most loyal ones. So Rocha himself explained how he was taught how to put a persona of being a conservative, of being an anti-communist, of being against the Cuban regime, pro-America. And his own words said how he despised America and despised and wanted to do everything he could for the Cuban Revolution. But he was taught how to hide that. And it helps. And he had discipline. Now, whether all of them are able to do that, I don't know what other training goes in there, because we've only really had a couple of really high level, Ana Belén Montes and Rocha, that have come out, and neither of them are going to really, Ana Belén Montes wouldn't provide any information. And I don't know if he will or not. He seems to be the type that likes to brag and talk. So from what we're seeing, but there's two things that I find very interesting about Rocha. Number one was the reason he got caught was there was a tip that he was a spy. The FBI is not divulging where they got that tip. But an undercover FBI agent reached out to him and told them that he was a Cuban agent and contacting him to give him instructions. And he responded on WhatsApp, of all places, according to reports. So I find it odd that he had been so eager to just meet up with somebody that that approaches him out of the blue, somebody he doesn't know, and tells him, unless they had some code words that they gave him, that which would lead me to the second interesting part of this. But I found it odd that he would like divulge so much information to someone he doesn't know, who he's assuming is a Cuban agent. So there had to be, that FBI undercover agent had to, either the guy's a total idiot, which I seriously doubt, because he wouldn't have been able to cover his tracks for 40 years, or that FBI agent had information that he could tell him, code words, whatever it is that they would use, to convince him that he was real. Which brings me to the second point, an interesting op-ed written in a Spanish language website. If you remember, and your listeners remember, the Cuban Five, the WASP network. Those were 5 Cubans. Well, there are actually 20 of them, I believe, or close to 20 of them, that were all part of the WASP spy network here, based in Miami. And they were infiltrating exile organizations. They were going down to the Boca Chica naval base in Key West and taking pictures and and sending him back to Cuban intelligence and trying to, and they actually had plans to blow up warehouses, set fire to buildings and stuff, and wreak havoc. But they were found out, they were captured. The whole group was captured. Some escaped, some turned witnesses, and they ended up convicting 5 of them. There were some, going back a few years after that, we learned there was the equivalent of the exterior minister of Cuba, gentleman I use the term gentleman loosely, named Ricardo Alarcón. There was a leak of documents from his office by his secretary, and those documents got into the hands of a Brazilian journalist. And in those documents, the story is told how Fidel Castro in the late 90s, when this whole WASP thing was going on, before they were captured, in the late 90s, was trying to open up was trying to get into a better relationship with Bill Clinton because of the fall of the Soviet Union. He needed to have better relations. They needed to get the embargo lifted, all of that stuff. So he was trying to thaw out the relationship. So as a token of goodwill, he handed the US government the files on this WASP network spies. Here's the spies. You can bust them right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he did that was to have Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the author, who's very good friends with Fidel Castro, who was visiting the White House. He sent those documents with him to the White House and turned them in. Nothing ever came of it, or they never followed up on it. They ended up getting caught. But based on that, this op-ed posits that perhaps this is the same situation with this Rocha guy. No one had found him. No one had any reason. He had retired. Why all of a sudden does he pop up? And it's believed that the Cuban dictatorship gave the tip to the FBI as a token of goodwill in exchange for we don't know what the US government has promised to give him back. But that's how I connect. How does this guy, who was a veteran, 40-year veteran of spying and very careful and covered his steps, all of a sudden start talking to an undercover FBI agent and starts divulging all this information? He had to think this guy was really a Cuban agent. And for him to think that undercover agent had to have given him something to prove to him that he was a Cuban agent. And that could only have come from Cuba.
That could be one interpretation. Another view to look at it is because Cuba is waking up amidst the new Cold War tensions, Russia, Iran, China, all, and of course Venezuela playing increasingly aggressive roles in Latin America. US has simply been engaging in more security-oriented focus on Cuba, and something may have come out of a broader operation targeting Cuban assets. That is a more optimistic way of looking at things, because something for me does not add up for this goodwill gesture explanation with Cuba. I'll get back to it momentarily. First, I wanted to follow up on something you said earlier, which is that the Soviet Union, unlike many countries, was looking and welcoming for ideological, and Cuba both, for ideological elements that would be loyal to the cause. Now, all of that is very much true. We have seen a long track record of various people, some of whom later became disillusioned with communism and defected in the United States and elsewhere in the West. But at some point, it is said that the Soviet Union itself became disillusioned with its own recruits, especially after fiascos with loose cannons like Lee Harvey Oswald and the like. It is said that they started to look for more traditional means of controlling their asset. Why is that, though, that Cuba has had a much lesser history of defectors from its intelligence assets? Why is it that we don't really hear of people from Cuba turning over to the West and exposing the records? How is it that their better success of getting young ideologues and turning them into very successful spies?
Well, I mean, there have been defections, and
Mm-hmm,
I can't name them off the top of my head, but I know there has been defections. There've been defections of high-ranking Cuban officials
mm-hmm,
that have provided a lot of information on how the intelligence works. Um, but I think it's also a matter of scale, where
mm-hmm,
Cuba is not. Uh, I can only imagine how many operatives the Soviet Union had in the United States, in 1979, as opposed to Cuba. Cuba maybe had, just to say a number 10, the Soviet Union probably had, 2,000 or 10,000, who knows? So it's a matter of scale where, you're going to see a lot more defections. You're, you have a lot more chances of that happening, but it does happen on the Cuba side, but they are and you also got to look at it from the Soviet Union was never viewed as David versus Goliath, where Cuba is viewed by the left and by communists and by Marxists and by socialists, by people sympathetic. The reason they're sympathetic to Cuba is because there is this poor little tiny country that all they want to do is give this wonderful life to their people, universal health care, free education, and the big bad United States, the imperialists don't want to let them. Poor Cuba, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. But the Cuban government capitalizes on that perception. So a lot of people, the reason, and I can tell you this from conversations I've had with leftists, discussions I've had about Cuba, where they actually really do think that the Cuban government is just this poor little altruistic, benevolent government that just wants to help people, and the U.S. won't let them. But of course, they have no idea about political prisoners. They have no idea about the oppression. They have no idea about how Cubans don't have enough food to eat, but the Castro family drive around in Mercedes, fly around in private jets, and have yachts vacation in the Mediterranean. That blows their mind every single time. But I think that has a lot to do with the loyalty part of it, because they don't feel they're just betraying communism, they're betraying David against Goliath. And it's
mm-hmm.
not just a hatred of the United States or a hatred of capitalism. It's a feeling of kinship, of wanting to protect, the vulnerable. They see Cuba as vulnerable. So that's I think that might be why you don't see the people that they attract. They want those people, the ones that see it as a fight of David versus Goliath. With the Soviet Union, and of course, I was a kid growing up during the Cold War. But the perception was always, this superpower versus this other superpower, and there's these two, Godzilla versus King Kong. Where in Cuba, it's this little tiny country that the U.S. is trying to stomp on.
Now, there's another issue that I wanted to follow up with you before getting back to discussing the broader context in the Cuban security threat um, direction, which is that both Montes and Rocha were recruited at a relatively young age at a time where, of course, there was plenty of campus penetration by Soviet and communist spies, but the overall climate during was the peak of Cold War. It was quite patriotic, bipartisan in many ways, not without its problems, but overall, the mindset on us versus them was very much pretty clear. Today, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ironically, we live in a different world where US has had some dealings with both Cuba and post-Soviet countries, including Moscow, where there's been efforts to cooperate with China and other communist regimes on various issues, and where the campus ideological climate is basically in the news every day due to the high level of radicalization among students overall.
Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that Cuba for many years has been out of sight and this much more radicalized and friendly climate made the last 20 years more actually better for recruitment than the Cold War?
I totally agree with you. You have what you're seeing is it's the law of the harvest. You reap what you sow. And communists, starting with the Soviet Union and then later with Cuba, they planted seeds back in the 60s. The Soviet Union planted seeds back in the 40s. And you start seeing, I mean, I think a perfect example of this is they planted all these seeds and all these people that, and then they guide them. They're saying, if you really want to go make a difference, go get a job at the State Department. And now go get a job at the CIA. Go join the military. Go, get a job in a place where you can influence. And but I'm only going to be, work in the mailroom. Yes, but you work your way up, and in 20 years you'll be in a position with more power, and you'll be able to make a difference. Soviets started doing that early on in the 40s and 50s. Cubans did the same thing. Rocha being a perfect example, recruited when he was in college. And they start guiding them. Rocha was guided to join the State Department. He was taught and told how to answer the questions and how to appear that you're, all 100% America and I'm here to defend America, and how to cover your tracks. He was taught how to do that. And I think all those seeds that they sowed decades ago, you see the harvest now, where you see a State Department that is coming out against the policy of the President of the United States and protesting and signing letters and stuff. Your job is not to give your opinion to the public on what U.S. policy should be. Your job is to analyze and do your job and to do the will of the elected leaders and the appointed people that are in power of the State Department. But this boldness, to me, is unprecedented. I think they feel that they have so much numbers now that they no longer have to hide. That they can come right out and just say it. And that's scary. That's scary because this is where Cuba policy is being, not Cuba policy, foreign policy, including Cuba and China and everything else is being made. And it's going through the hands of people who do not have the best interests of the United States before them.
That brings me back to the point about why I'm not entirely 100% comfortable with the view that there is a shadow deal between the Cuban regime and the US. The reason for that is that there's been a lot of focus on how Russia has cut back on its funding to the Cuban security services due to various other demands, priorities, whether be it Ukraine or other parts of the world.
Right.
But in recent years, we have seen, starting approximately 2016, that despite all the credit going on to Venezuela, a much larger, wealthier state with a huge network penetrating entire Latin America and beyond, we have seen Cuba once again starting to play a more active role beyond arguing with the White House about embargo and sanctions and reforms and entirely, and political statements and internal human rights abuses. We have seen it play a role in the mysterious discussions over the so-called Havana syndrome, which the CIA has denied has anything to do with any state apparatus, but which mysteriously only seem to affect diplomatic and intelligence personnel and nobody else in the vicinity of those areas. We have seen the Cuban fighters coming to Russia. We have seen um, the stories about the Chinese intelligence base supposedly being constructed in Cuba. So we are seeing that at the very least, Cuba is seeming to awaken as a supporting in its supporting role to the new network of anti-Western regimes. How does that bite with its willingness to cut deals over, Old Spice with the US, given that they are clearly becoming not only a hostile actor, but a potentially logistically relevant actor that is entirely and very much with the network of anti-US axis?
Well, you said a key word there at the end, relevant. And that's all Cuba wants to be, is relevant.
Mm.
And not for reasons that they want to be on the world stage and they want people to pay attention to them. There's two things that the Cuban dictatorship wants and needs. And it's not the workers, it's not the proletariat, it's not Marxism, it's not power to the people. It's money and power. They want money, they want power, and to maintain, they have the power in Cuba, and to maintain that power, they need money. Obviously, their centralized economy is a disaster, has always been a disaster. They were funded by the Soviet Union until the fall of the Soviet Union. And then when that fell apart, the Cuban dictatorship's like a parasite, and it latches onto a host. And for decades, its host was the Soviet Union. When that fell apart, it latched onto a new host, which was Venezuela, was an incredibly rich country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, more than the Middle East. There's more oil there than anywhere else in the world. But in the end, thanks to socialism, that too, as the old saying goes, if you put a communist in charge of a desert, you'll be out of sand in 5 years. That too, they messed up. So now Cuba they latched onto that host, sucked it dry, and they got nowhere else. So they're desperately trying to find, because they need money, because money allows them to pay the state security that keeps the people under control. It allows them to bring in just enough food for them to not riot in the streets out of hunger, but not too much food that they get too excited and want something crazy like freedom. They want to have that money. So Cuba wants to be relevant. One thing to keep in mind is we started the comment that we sort of talking about espionage and spying. Cuba doesn't spy on the U.S. because they want to find out what U.S. policy is going to be towards Cuba. They spy on everything. They get information on every single thing because that information is worth money. They sell it to the Chinese. They sell it to the Russians. They sell it to the Iranians. They sell it to the North Koreans. They sell it to whoever will pay them money. To them, intelligence is a commodity to be sold. So I would venture to say that perhaps 90% of Cuba's espionage is gathering intelligence to sell on the market. And then they get some information that they need for themselves, regarding U.S. policy. But they're not spying on the U.S. to find out why does Cuba care what the defense systems are at the Boca Chica naval base in Key West? They're not going to attack the naval base. But they could sell that information to China. So what they want is cash. So that's the reason that Cuba Cuba has a collapsing healthcare system. They don't have enough doctors. They don't have enough nurses. The hospitals are falling apart. They don't have medicine. Cubans who go to the hospital have to bring their own bed sheets. They have to bring their own pillows. They have to bring their own syringes because they don't have medical supplies. Yet Cuba, the second biggest revenue generator for the Cuban government, is selling Cuban doctors and nurses abroad as slave labor. They send them to Brazil, they send them to Europe, they send them to Africa, Latin America, and the doctors get 10% of their pay of what the Cuban government gets paid. The Cuban government keeps 90. It's slave labor because as soon as those doctors arrive in that country, their passport is taken from them and they cannot leave. They cannot go anywhere. And they must work in those conditions.
Now,
so what Cuba wants is...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yes, sorry. There was a delay.
No, I was just going to say it's all about money and power. And the reason Cuba wants to be relevant now is it raises their standing. That makes it easier for them to make money. And number two, everybody talks about the embargo, and a lot of people are under this impression that the U.S. is embargoing food and is embargoing medicine and won't sell and is not allowing anybody to sell any of this stuff. That is completely untrue. Food, medicine, basic items, all of that is perfectly legal to sell to the Cuban government. What the Cuban government cannot access is credit from the U.S. And that's what the Cuban government wants, because there's never been a loan the Cuban government is not willing to default on. They owe billions of dollars to the former Soviet Union, now Russia. They owe billions of dollars to China. They owe billions of dollars to the Paris Club and to European banks, billions of dollars to Brazil, billions all over the place, and they will never pay it back because that's their business plan. It's the communist business plan. You give me money, I keep it. And that's it. That's the communist business plan. So they want credit from the U.S. because what they're going to do is, if the U.S. allows us, Cuba, to gain credit from the World Bank or the IMF, wherever, they're going to borrow $100 million. They're going to buy $50 million of food, and they're going to put $50 million in their pocket. And then they're never going to pay back the $100 million. And then the people will go hungry. Well, they're going hungry, but we need to restructure this debt. And in the meantime, our people are going hungry. We need more money to feed our people. So they use the people as a bargaining chip to be able to get these loans. So the embargo does not stop any of the food. The U.S. is one of the top importers of food in Cuba. The difference is that Cuba needs to pay for those items in cash. They need to pay ahead of time. So if they're ordering $4 million worth of chicken, they need to pay $4 million before that chicken can leave the port and head to Havana.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that U.S. is not about to attack Cuba, because just in the last couple of days, such accusations exactly were being made. And the last time anyone accused of the United States and NATO of plotting invasions and attacks, we've had Russia invade Ukraine twice. Is it possible that Russia and Cuba and their entire network are setting stage for a new Cuban Missile Crisis?
It's always possible. That's always possible because of Cuba's strategic position. You basically have an island sitting 90 miles away from U.S. shores. And it could be used as a bargaining chip. I have to question, the wisdom of a Russia doing that, with NATO being right around its, which takes us back to the original Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the whole issue that Khrushchev was like, you guys got NATO with missiles pointed at us, and we don't have any missiles close to you. But it was still not, at the end of the day, Russia removed their missiles from Cuba, not because of some great negotiating skills, but because the U.S. agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey. So they got what they wanted. The Russians got what they wanted. Less missiles pointed at them. And so they took our missiles. They may use it as something like that. China may worry me more because China just doesn't care. China has a 50-year plan, and if in that 50-year plan it says do this on this year, whether it sounds like a good idea or not, they're still going to do it, even if it sounds like a bad idea. So they scare me more of a China doing that, but it may not fall within the framework that they're envisioning. They think a lot more long term in the way they do their policy.
Now, getting back to Rocha, I wanted to compare, while there's been many comparisons drawn to a number of other Cuban cases, the comparison that springs back to mind immediately for me is a more recent Russian case involving a guy named Peter Debens, who likewise, after a military stint, which ended with a discharge after he was already spying for GRU at the time. He ended up penetrating U.S. Washington security circles, and none of that ended up in the official prosecution files. He only went to prison for 25 years, but still, he went to prison for his early espionage involving his previous military career. Furthermore, none of his potential networks in Washington appear to have been investigated. None of his contacts were faced any sort of security scrutiny, as far as I know from my discussions with people who had been close to him or in touch with him. Can we see a potential for a repeat of the same thing with Roger, that he will be investigated for things that are somewhat he's known about his government career, but his private security violations and his networks and potentially all the people he recruited and various accessories that he that have assisted him over the years, they will be left to continue their jobs.
Let me tell you, and I hate to sound cynical, but 20 years ago, it wouldn't surprise me if something like that would happen, where they only picked, some very minor stuff just to give the show that they're doing something, and then all the other stuff stays hidden. That wouldn't have surprised me if it happened 20 years ago. Now, even less so, because of we're living in a totally different world, and from the State Department to the Department of Justice to the Pentagon to everybody, it's not. I don't have the confidence I had before, and there's an interesting twist to that's just recent in the past day or so with Rocha.
Mm-hmm.
His hearing was postponed till next month, and a lot of speculation that I've read is that they're working on a plea deal. And he was supposed to appear in court, I believe it was yesterday, and then it got moved to next month, to January. Out of the blue, no explanation. We're going to move it now to January. And the speculation is that the Department of Justice and the FBI and Rocha's attorneys and probably the State Department are all working together and come up with a plea deal where it could be a situation exactly as you described. They'll pick one or two or five or six little things that he did that they could prove, try him for that, throw him in prison and sweep everything else that he did under the rug. Which would be unfortunate, because you're absolutely right. 40 years of spying, he touched a lot of people. He touched a lot of positions. There's a lot of people that could be a direct connection to him in the State Department and in other branches of government that should be fully investigated. It really should be known.
If we were looking at this whole situation from the perspective of our adversaries, including Cuba, what does the handling of these cases and what does the media climate and the way all of this is being covered, what message does it signal to these adversaries?
To me, it sends a message that we're idiots. That we can have a spy, holding the position of ambassador. Ambassador. I mean, talk about vetting. They're the representative of the United States in a foreign nation. They have access to any info. I read an article where he had access to all information. He had the highest security clearance. He had access to everything. He could take a look and pull it out in the State Department. And if we can't, one thing is that you get, one person that kind of like an Ana Belén Montes that kind of like snuck in and I've read a couple books on her, and she was a spy. That was her nature. She was just one of those cloak and dagger people, incredibly smart, diligent, dutiful, careful, meticulous, and she was very careful on what she did, and it wasn't so much she got caught because she got sloppy, as that she got caught because there were too many coincidences going on, and those coincidences led to an investigation that some of her officials around her and her bosses were, no, not Anna. No, you're barking up the wrong tree. She's one of us. But it was a couple of investigators that said, no, there's something. And they kept fishing and snooping and following her. And that's how they finally were able to catch her. But she never did anything to out of the, anything out of the blue. But she was a professional. So you can expect, one like that. But we've had several like that in the State Department. Ana Belén Montes, Walter Kendall Myers, this guy now, Rocha. And who God knows how many others that we never found out about. So that, I think it makes us look, from an intelligence perspective, and they're laughing at us. They're laughing at it because it's the United States supposed to be one of the top, and one of the toughest places to ever do this. And look at the Cubans, those little Cubans, the little David in the Caribbean. Look at the spies they can get in there. So I think it's a very bad look.
Now, another curious thing that I'd like to draw attention on to is the fact that this individual, that Rocha, was actually involved in some of the countries that you would expect somebody with his background to be involved in: Nicaragua, Bolivia, states that were
Right.
critical during the Cold War and consequently have become major headaches for the United States from a security and political perspective. And that also reminds me of a different case, a case of a guy named Andrew Peake, who was a part of the Trump's national security circle and who was investigated for various security concerns, and who was actually on the very much involved on the Eastern European and Russian fronts, and then consequently joined the Atlantic Institute on their Middle Eastern department, where he has access to a lot of the kind of information that Russia, for instance, would be very interested in. He never ended up being prosecuted. He was investigated, and that in itself is not anything to brag about. But the similarity there is both of these individuals, presumably with links to hostile regimes, were targeting particular areas of interest. They were potential red flags around that alone, and yet those relevant departments, they never made the connections between what those states would have wanted and any sort of suspicious behavior. I mean, okay, Rocha may have been smarter and more careful than Alba, but still, looking back, wouldn't it make sense for the departments of particularly sensitive areas within State Department or intelligence or any national security agency to vet people who are going into particularly sensitive areas when there is a crisis, especially a critical time of heightened tensions, more carefully? What does it say about the fact that these guys not only get to spy, but get to spy on exactly the things that they want?
Yeah, and that's the reason, and that's the whole plan, is to put people like this that are in there. Now, you mentioned, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and I just want to make the point that every bad thing that happens in Latin America, with these socialist dictatorships and these socialist uprisings and revolutions since 1959 or since 1955, Cuba, the Castro regime has been involved. What happened in Venezuela is the Castro regime. Bolivia was the Castro regime. Nicaragua, the Castro regime. Ecuador failed in Ecuador, was the Castro regime. Peru, Castro regime. Argentina, Castro. They are involved in all of these because Brazil with Lula is the Castro regime. Lula made hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, why would the Brazilian government give the Cuban government a loan for $484 million, knowing that they're never going to pay it back? But that money, some of it was coming back to Lula. But anyways, I digress. The Castro dictatorship is involved in all of this. So by having someone like a Rocha that's in Bolivia, a Rocha that's in Argentina, a Rocha that's involved with these Latin American groups and Latin American think tanks and all of that, they're getting all the information they need, because by getting that information, it helps them with their network in Latin America and their whole, which goes back to what I said, money and power. They want money, so they want these Latin American countries to give them business, to send them money, to buy slave doctors from them, to send their tourists over, to lend them money that they'll never pay back. All those types of things. So that's makes perfect sense for them to do it. And you see it not only with Cuba and the example that you mentioned. You take any special interest group and you'll always find that there's some enemy of the US that has a spy, someone in there, because they want to be able to pull that information out.
I mean, that raises a question about whether or not these agencies conduct periodic reviews of their departments, but it does not appear to be the case, or if they do, they certainly miss a lot. But that brings us back to Cuba and its very active position. As you've described, far from taking a back seat, it's been highly involved all over, next door to the United States. The Biden administration literally publicly announced that the Monroe Doctrine is dead, thus making the entire region a free for well, everybody. Now, Cuba at one point has been quite active in supporting all sorts of liberation terrorist movements all over the world. Do you think it can come back to that more global role beyond region and beyond sending occasional mercenaries to fight in Ukraine or to lend support to Russia? Can it return to this sort of militia building capabilities? Your sound has disappeared.
Battery was dying on my. Can you hear me
Yes,
better?
that was actually. Yes,
Okay.
yes. It was basically very much close to the end for me anyway.
Yeah. If the money is there, if there's someone willing to pay for it, you can count on it. Remember those Cubans that went over there, Russians paid for it. Supposedly they were paying $2,000 a month or whatever it is. They're not paying those guys. They're paying the Cuban government.
Mm-hmm.
Those guys are getting $200 a month
Mm.
to go risk their lives. Cuban government is getting 1,800, assuming that they're giving them that much. They're not just paying them $50 a month. But that's how it works. Cuba supports terrorist regimes as long as they pay them. They need to pay for the services. You want to come hide out in Cuba, like you have ELN, Spanish terrorists, and you have ELN Colombian terrorists, ETA Spanish terrorists, all hiding in Cuba. They're these narco terrorists are getting paid for that service. Cuba's not opening their arms and says you can come in here and stay and live wonderfully. You got to pay to have that. So Cuba's been caught trafficking arms for North Korea. They traffic arms probably for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for Colombian narco terrorists, for Spanish terrorists, bombs. They'll do if you pay them, they'll do it. Cuba there was an article that came out the other day that was reminding everybody that Fidel Castro had a deal with Pablo Escobar. They made millions of dollars using Cuba as a stepping stone on importing drugs from Colombia into the U.S. with the help of the Cuban military. If you pay, they'll do it. So a lot of people think it's a strictly ideological thing. But in my personal opinion, the Castro family is communist because that's what the system of government that gives them the ability to maintain power, which is probably the reason 99% of communists that hold power are communists, not because they believe it helps the proletariat. It's because it gives them absolute power. So number one, it's not an ideology thing. It's not that they want to crush imperial. If communism tomorrow crushed all capitalist society and all imperialism, the world would die of hunger in 6 months because they can't produce the food. They can't produce the oil. And they know that. The funniest thing about socialism and communism is that it needs capitalism to fund it, because without capitalism, it can't exist. So it's not an ideological thing. It's all a money and power thing. So they want the money and they need the money to be able to continue to stay in power. So I think that's the best way to sort of approach and look at how the Castro regime thought process works, because it's not that they don't, that they refuse to betray their socialist principles, is that they don't want to lose power. And that's what it comes down to. The Chinese are as Marxist as the Cubans are, but they allow capitalism because they can control it. The Cubans can't control the capitalism. They don't know how. They haven't figured out how to control it without losing power. So that's their fear. They allow a little bit of capitalism for them to make money. You can go to Cuba today, stay in a all-inclusive resort. You'll have steak, you have lobster, you got all types of fruits, cakes, whatever you want. You can enjoy all of that, $500 a night, and enjoy a wonderful beach and drinks. Cubans are starving. You can go to Cuba and have plastic surgery if you pay for it, and do your cosmetic surgery and whatever. As I mentioned earlier, Cubans, the hospitals are falling apart. They don't have syringes. They don't have gloves. They don't have sheets. They don't have supplies. It's all about the money. It's not about the ideology. So if you approach the Cuban regime or the Castro regime from that perspective, that it's all about money, then it sort of helps you understand what motivates them. Are they willing to help Hamas, for instance? Are they willing to help Hezbollah launch a terrorist attack in Miami or in Washington, D.C.? If Hezbollah pays them, yes, they'll do it. If you pay them enough money, they'll do it. Not because they hate America, but because they want the money.
Well, interestingly enough, while Russia has shifted its strategy from relying outright on proxy forces to creating fake militias that the government controls and using those militias to prop up assorted dictators, we could see some of these mercenary states, smaller states, return to playing this increasingly active global role because we are seeing that the tensions are heating up and all these actors are becoming increasingly open about their meddling and their efforts to assert control and take over institutions from within in various Western societies. So it may be that Cuba could achieve the relevance it so badly desires in the most negative of ways. But do you think we are starting to wake up to that reality, or do you think it's a little too late? They've already gone halfway to where we need to be, and there may not be anything done to put an end to their to their emerging from this cocoon.
Well, here's the thing, and here's another dynamic in the whole Cuba thing that sort of has to be taken into consideration when you try to analyze why they do the things they do and how they're going to act. Cuba can do the worst. A perfect example, July 2021, Cuba arrested tens of thousands as mass uprisings and peaceful protests took place in Cuba, arrested tens of thousands, shot them in the streets. They killed people. And what happened to them on the international community? What happened to them at the UN? They got a seat on the Human Rights Commission, right? So they have impunity. So they know that I could do something really, really bad, but it's okay because the European Union, the UN, Canada, obviously Russia and China, security seat holders, none of them they're not going to say anything to me. I'm not going to get any, not even get a slap on the wrist. Maybe they'll let somebody make a speech at the UN saying how bad Cuba. So they know they have impunity. So it's like they could do stuff and there's no real consequences to it. And until there's consequences, it's really hard to determine how far Cuba is willing to go. Because think about it. If you can do anything and there's no consequences to what you do, where's the limit? So, that's where it gets really tricky with Cuba because there's only the United States. In the last vote, it was the United States and Israel were the only countries that voted against that stupid, embargo resolution at the UN that they hold, that little farcical vote that they hold every year. It's non-binding, has nothing to do. It's just a farce. But only the U.S. and Israel is usually only a couple of countries that stand by it, that stand against it. How do you have a serial human rights abuser that has fought in foreign wars, contributed to what happened in Angola, tried to invade Grenada, has practically runs Venezuela? Everybody talks about Maduro. Cuba is being run by high-ranking Cuban officials, military officials that are there. Maduro's just the puppet they put out. Maduro's entire inner circle is all Cuban. He's completely controlled. Very similar to what you saw in Chile with Allende, where everybody said, Allende, they took down, a duly elected. Allende was completely controlled by the Cubans. He was surrounded by Cubans, and he was beat. And that was the reason he was deposed, because he was no longer working for the Chilean people. He was working for the Cubans. But that goes against the whole narrative of the left. But it's the same thing that you see in Venezuela. You don't see it in Nicaragua because Ortega already had power before, and he's more of a thug. He's as much of a thug as the Castros are. So they're sort of like a merger of equals. But you saw it in Ecuador with Correa. You 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 saw it in Bolivia with Evo Morales, and with in Argentina with Kirchner. It's just they control, and they get in there and they just pull the strings and manipulate, and they put people in power that they can control. So it just comes down to, as long as there's no consequences for what they do, it's nearly impossible to, the only thing that limits them is that they don't have the money. They don't have the money or the assets to be able to do something huge. That's the only thing that limits them.
Well, as the crises around the world proliferate, the US and other states stand with a stark choice whether to allow these crises to continue running amok and various bad actors proliferate and find opportunities and maybe earn enough money to actually be able to pull off increasingly more dangerous stunts, or whether to put an end to it before it gets too out of hand. And I think increasingly, unfortunately, we are letting all of this get out of control. And I'm not entirely sure that with the crisis of leadership we are seeing, not just in the US but in Europe and elsewhere, this is not going to be a much more difficult battle to fight than the Cold War, when the lines were drawn and they were clear and the commitment level was far more engaged.
Yeah, I
Unfortunately.
think I think you make a brilliant point there, Irina. It's during the Cold War, you knew there was a clear line. There was one side and there was the other. There was freedom and there was communism. And but that's all been blurred now. That's all been blurred. Um, you have so many college kids that think, you know, capitalism is bad and socialism is good, as they sip their, $12 lattes, on their $2,000 MacBook Pro, and, wearing their $400 sneakers. So it's there's no longer that line, because when I was a kid growing up, in the Cold War, you knew there was the good guys and the bad guys. And, the bad guys thought they were the good guys, and, vice versa. But it was two completely different systems. It was like the communists want to live in a certain way, in a centralized economy, boom, 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 with, everybody driving the same car, everybody doing doing the same thing, wearing the same clothes, whatever. And then the capitalists are, the decadents. But now there's this mix where they think socialism and communism, they could enjoy the same life they enjoy under capitalism. So they think it's perfectly fine to be a communist and enjoy capitalist trappings, never stopping to think that none of these things would exist if it wasn't for capitalism. So with these lines blurred, you no longer have this clear demarcation. You want to live life like this, or you want to live life like that. So they think they could continue living in a collective society, enjoying, the same things that they enjoy now, and they have no idea. They need to spend time in a communist country and see what life is really like in Cuba
But that
or North Korea.
makes selling a pro-freedom message a lot harder, and I think even, not impossible but hard. And given the level of complete completely disastrous communication and lack of understanding of our own values, I think even the idea of freedom has also become blurred in many people's lives. And at the end of the day, the only way to win a clear victory is also to be clear about the goals and objectives. And until we figure that out, I think things can only get worse.
Yeah, and we're not getting a real clear picture of our goals and objectives from leadership.
Let's hope that changes as these actors increasingly show their true face once again. Well, thank you so much
Yes.
for your time. It was an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I hope our audiences will get a broader look into what all this means in the context of geopolitics, security, and beyond. Through the lens of an individual case and into broader spheres. Um, Thank you for everyone who's been watching us. We'll be back again Tuesday night, 9 p.m. EST, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. And thank you again to Alberto de la Cruz for joining us today. Have a great night.
Thank you, Irina. It's been fun.